So
protect.
let's start like this. When we talk about the sphirot and the Partsufim, they have these different levels of being examples of the macrocosm and the microcosm, right? So they're the general ways in which Hashem emanates and relates to the world, and they're the way that Hashem embodies whatever we talk about when we talk about Hashem inside each person, and also inside space and time and the soul, right? Like from Sefer Yetzirah. In Chinese medicine, when we talk about things like the heart and the kidneys, and we talk about the Shen and the Jing and the Qi, we really don't talk about so much in terms of the universal, right? Because we're not talking about the idea of God, but we talk about that really just in terms of the person and their embodiment of aspects of heaven, earth, and then a person embodying those aspects of heaven and earth, right? Does that make sense so far? So when we talk about something like the heart, right? So in the Kabbalah, in the Pasukim that we see, we always try and relate the heart to Bina, Halev Mevin, the aspect of Bina, right? So when we talk about the heart in relation to Chinese medicine, there we talk about the heart in relation to the Shen and the emperor. Okay, so we can certainly make a jump and connect those two things, but because of the way they reflect each system, they're really not the same, right? Certainly we can learn from both systems things about the other system, but the first thing to understand is they're not the same. So when we talk about the heart and the king likes to be quiet, right? The heart likes to be quiet in the Chinese system because that's the nature of the king. The king sits in the palace. It wants to be peaceful. And as long as the heart is peaceful, everything goes smoothly. Now, when the heart is not peaceful in Chinese medicine, right, it calls on the help of other organs in order to maintain that peace. So one of those things we might see is the kidneys, who are called the advisors in Chinese medicine. Now, interestingly enough, in the Gemara, the kidneys are also called the advisors. They're called the deep advisors, also known as the Avot, right? So we see something like Avraham Avinu. Sometimes we call Avraham Avinu Chesed. We call Yitzhak Avinu Gevura, the right arm and the left arm. We call Yaakov Avinu the torso, the body. But sometimes we call Avraham and Yitzhak and Yaakov the advisors. And they're the deep advisors that come to us because they're in our past, right? And we get that advice of experience from the past, and they come and they advise the heart, the king, which we call David HaMelech, right, on how to move forward. So David HaMelech is sometimes seen as Malchut, sometimes that's the mouth, sometimes Malchut is the ground, sometimes Malchut is the genitalia, and sometimes we look at that Malchut as being the heart. Now, when that Malchut is the heart, we call that the upper Malchut. When the Malchut is the other things, we call that the lower Malchut. Does that make sense so far?
Yeah.
Okay. So when we talk about something like in Chinese medicine, the way that the heart has to function in order to control all the aspects of the body, obviously its main function of controlling the body has to do with its aspect of the Shen, which we could loosely translate as consciousness, right? Consciousness obviously is one of the main aspects that we would seek to encourage in mindfulness. And we know that the Shen dwells in the blood, right? And the blood goes everywhere in the body. And that's how the heart rules over the whole body, through that aspect of the Shen going everywhere in the body. Mm-hmm. Now the kidneys, because of their power inside of Chinese medicine, they're the source of Jing and also the source of Yin and Yang, right? And we call them the advisors. So they're source of fire and water, and they're the place where we can see the past moves into the present and into the future. That's something that in Chinese medicine we might call the jur. The jur is often translated as, intention. But when we talk about, we talk about that aspect of the Shen as being the place where the past, taking into account the future, can manifest itself in the present. In Kabbalah, when we think about those things, we think about how the past is fixed in the future to allow the present to unfold in a more complete way. And that's something we might call tikkun, right? And consciousness, as it's expressed through mindfulness, when we pay attention to those things, right, when we put our consciousness intent on the moment, on what's happening in the moment, what immediately happens is that the past, now as it manifests itself in the present, it loses its control over the present, and the present now can manifest itself into the future as a way of being fixed from the past. So those things that tie us down, which we might call in Chinese medicine stagnation or phlegm, right? When we move into the present, a lot of those things now can dissipate, because what we're doing is we're not allowing the past to get stuck. We're moving them through the present into the future.
Yeah, this could be something similar also to neuroscience, no? In the sense that we have to work on reprogramming, okay, our mental, our midot, our ways, okay? So if consciousness comes in, the violence of the wave of the subconscious and this programmation is held under control.
Sure. Also because what we as people spend most of our time doing by thinking about things all the time, constantly thinking, is we avoid our fears. And what's the greatest fear that we possess? Probably the fear of the unknown. And where is the unknown? Well, that's the entire future, which is completely unknown, right? That's how we often think about it. But really, also the past is unknown, because when we try and think about how to move into the future, right? We look back in our past and we try and turn that into a straight line from the past to the present to the future. And then when we look at the past, it may not be what the past really happened, right? We make up a lot of stories for ourselves about what really happened in the past in order to move through the present into the future. But those stories aren't necessarily true. That's why it says, Emet me'eretz titzmach, the truth sprouts from the ground. What does that mean, truth sprouts from the ground? The ground is also an aspect of malchut. And the nature of emet sprouting from that is it ties the past to the future through the present. Aleph is the past, Taf is the future, and Mem is the present, right? So we have this movement of beginning, middle, and end all tied together. Often we do that by telling ourselves stories about the past, which is also relatively unknown to us. As we know, when you see two people will have the same experience, and then when they talk to each other about it, they'll have a completely different vision of what actually happened, right? From the subjective. So the only way that we really can fix that is by being in the present, because we can't fix the past really, because we don't really know what happened in the past, because we're always making up those stories in our subconscious in order to move forward, right, to be expressed in the conscious. The body, however, remembers everything. And in Kabbalah or in Judaism, we might call that Ein shichacha lifnei kisei hakavod. There's no forgetting before the throne of glory. What does that mean? Well, in the Kabbalah, we understand that to mean like the throne of glory has to do with the aspect of Bina, again, the heart, the mother, the upper king, the upper kingship, right? So there's no forgetting. Everything that happens is carved into us, into what we call the 3 books of Rosh Hashanah. Or we call those the 3 books that are mentioned in the first Mishnah of the Sefer Yetzirah. B'Sefer, B'Sfar, B'Sipur. In telling, counting, and their combination to make communication. So what we're doing with our subconscious is constantly trying to make things make sense to us, right? But everything that's happened is already existing in the body. Where does it exist in the body? Going back to what we said before, it exists in the blood, which is what holds the shen, or in Judaism, it holds the nefesh, which is the lowest sense of consciousness. But the lowest sense of consciousness includes everything from creativity to intelligence to emotional life. All those things are included in the nefesh, right?
But also, really the physiology, the physical cells, they also are remembering.
The physical self remembers. It's like where things are written into, right? When we talk about the books.
For example, the bones, the bones, all our bones will
the whole physical self, things are written into. But the way that it communicates with each other is through the consciousness which dwells in the blood. Now, there's obviously a level of consciousness that dwells in the bones, which we might relate to the kidney, which we might call the jur, right? There's a sense of consciousness which relates to the muscles and the flesh, which we might call the E in Chinese medicine, or something like um, thinking about things, being
The earth. So that's why it met me
earth.
mach. So it's gonna come out from this objective, rational approach, which is
Right.
in the how you call it, in earth element, in the earth element.
In
No.
the earth element, which also we said as before is malchut, right? And that's the place where the past meets the future in the present. And it can be fixed and the truth can come to light. And when the truth comes to light, we can call that again the nature of tikkun. In medicine, when that happens, we can call that healing, because Chinese have a very simple idea of healing. They say, if everything is constantly changing, which in Judaism we also see that, except for God, who never changes, right? If everything is constantly changing, when something gets stuck and doesn't change, it creates dis-ease. But the ability to change with the changes would be defined as health.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, also God calls himself Ani Hashem Lo Shaniti. That's the difference between you and me. You cannot not change. I can.
Right, because it would not be possible for God to change, because that would imply some level of imperfection. And God has to be perfect by the nature of whatever we mean by God. And we certainly don't mean, an old man on a hill with a lightning bolt, or any kind of person, or anything like that. But our ability to understand God comes from our ability to understand ourselves. And I think the Chinese offer a lot of that knowledge and wisdom that can be used in order to understand ourselves better, and therefore have whatever kind of view of the godly, which is not really possible, but it's a movement towards that. And then we can model ourselves, like in Torah Devora, on those aspects of the way that God relates to the God's creation. And the more we relate to that and model ourselves on that, like the 13 midot, the Yud Gimel midot of Rachamim, which you mentioned before, which has to do embodied in the hair and the forehead and the eyes and the nose and the mouth and the ears, etc. The more we can embody that in ourselves, then we can say we're coming closer to God. And the closer we come to God, again, we can call that tikkun.
Yes, yes. And actually, the Sefer Yetzirah is saying something very similar. And when it says, there is 12 months, constellation, etc., and then there is 12 senses that one has to perfect.
Right.
And these senses that we have to perfect could also be parallels to organs as souls. Because when I finally learned a bit of Chinese medicine, I finally could understand and relate to some concepts of Kabbalah that I see engraved in the prayers. For example, this prayer that we say in the morning, bless you God, that Aneshama shenatata bi tehorai. You created it, you formed it, you blew it, into me, and you preserve it. Yes, and you preserve it into me. All the time that the neshama is in me, I bless you, God, etc. And this I find so much more complex than what it looks like, because all the time that the soul is within me, I bless you, God. It's because many times, I don't know if you or another acupuncturist was telling me, I'm just trying to feel if your neshama, your shen, wants to be in or out. Okay. So sometime, and this also the Talmud says, the Shekhinah, when there is disorder, violence, and all these things, the Shekhinah goes away. And so also the Shen can leave its nest in the heart and just go around. So I'd like you to talk a bit about this aspect of the Shen being able really to go away. And it's interesting that also Kabbalah says when the heart goes crazy, you know, the lungs come in and help it to. Okay. So,
Okay.
maybe
So let's just talk a little bit about the difference between the neshama and the shen,
yeah.
right? Because the shen is something that's manifest that we can actually experience, right? So we might really think that the shen is more like the ruach. When we talk about the ruach, I mean not the ruach, the nefesh. When we talk about the nefesh, the ruach, the neshama, right, and the chayim, the yichida. So when we talk about the ruach, we might think about that as more relating to the shen. Not the ruach, I'm sorry, the nefesh. Because everybody has a nefesh that is manifest in our bodies and that we experience. However, not everybody manifests and experiences the ruach. And really, the nature of the neshama, especially the pasuk you quoted before, neshama tahorahi, means that the nature of the neshama is it can never be blemished. Why? Because you could see that as being like the kav is called the neshama, the place where Hashem, the infinite, interacts with the finite, especially through human consciousness, we might call the kav, right? And that's then manifest in the Rishima. But that aside, because the neshama is that closest aspect that connects to the godly, right? It can never be in any way tuma. It can never be impure. It's not possible because its connection is completely pure from top to bottom. So what happens though is it becomes hidden and not manifest.
It leaves the body.
It only leaves the body when we die.
No, they say that sometimes the neshama, it's not really incarnated. That's some type of dissociation, let's call it.
It's not manifest, yeah. Right? So, but the way that ultimately it expresses itself in the body is that the neshama is enclosed in the ruach, and the ruach is enclosed in the nefesh. And the nefesh is what we consciously feel can act on us and in our body. So that's a little bit more like the shen. The shen is something that sits in the heart and it's manifest in the aspects of the body, but it can become clouded through different means. It can become hidden. It could even go into what we might call exile, like you mentioned before. Mm-hmm. But that exile it doesn't leave the heart. It buries itself deeper in the heart, mm-hmm. Right? It never leaves. It just goes deeper and becomes hidden. And then the first thing that manifests might be called the pericardium, which is something we often see in trauma. When someone has a severe trauma, right, their heart hides. And then the pericardium, which surrounds the heart, becomes the expression of the heart into the body. And that's very often what we see in things like liver qi stagnation, right? Because the liver and the pericardium, they have this very special connection in what we call the jue yin. You know what I'm talking about?
Well, I'm
in one of the 6
yes.
levels.
Yes.
It's not levels. Maybe levels is not the right word. 6,
yeah,
6 manifestations, the 6.
Front, the mask, the persona.
Right. So sometimes, when the heart becomes damaged, maybe through trauma or through something else, through different activities. So then it's like, do you remember when Ronald Reagan got shot, in 1982? So James Watt, he was the Secretary of State. He immediately stood up and said, I'm in charge, I'm in control. So very often when the heart retreats a little bit, the liver jumps up and says, I'm in control. And we see that very quickly, but people get angry at things, right? Something happens, they don't know how to deal with it. What's the immediate response? Anger. Even if the response is sadness, which we might think, oh, but that's the lungs, right? But that doesn't empower the body to move forward, so people end up expressing it as anger. Because that forces things to move. Because anger is like, you're adding wood onto the fire. So you want it to burn, you want it to spread out, you want it to move. Why do you want it to move? It goes back to what we said before. When there's no movement, right, we would call that dis-ease. When things move smoothly, they open up, we would call that health, the ability to change with the changes. Again,
so it has 2 phases, can have a destructive phase and another one that is benevolent.
Yeah.
Transformation.
Yeah, anger can often be very destructive, but anger is not always destructive. Sometimes you need a little bit of anger to break through something, but you have to realize that it can't be the controlling factor, right? It has to serve the larger purpose of opening something up, right? When it doesn't do that, just like sadness, right? Like Shlomo used to say, you have to have your heart broken, but you also have to be completely happy at the same time, right? It's the same kind of thing. You can be angry, but you can't be. You have to be happy, and you have to express it in a way that's tempered by righteousness, by tzedek.
Okay, so fantastic. So
in Chinese we call de, like in the Tao Te Ching.
Let's do this.
The symbol for de. Yeah.
Yeah. So let's give a strategy. Okay.
Wait, I can't hear you.
Because now we understand the process. So what happens when the liver takes over and we became a persona, and how can we bring back the king on the power?
Okay, so how do we bring back the king on the power? So maybe this goes back to the way you first started. There are many techniques for doing that. There are what we might call external techniques, where somebody helps us to do that. Acupuncture, herbs, massage, exercise, diet. People can guide us in all those ways, right? But ultimately, we have to make that movement. Somebody can't do it for us, right? So there might be like a yang approach where somebody takes medication, or herbs or something strong to force them back into that level. Then there's the yin approach where somebody will nourish us in a way that will help us return to a state of balance. How? Maybe they'll teach us some qigong that we can then practice, or some yoga, or some exercises, or maybe they'll talk to us and open our understanding, right? So that we can do it. But then the practice of it very often comes down to a technique of being aware of what's going on, being aware of what's in our control, what's not in our control, right? Losing our fear of the unknown and embracing the blessing that is found in the unknown, and then moving forward with that. Sounds easy, but it's not that easy.
Mm-hmm.
But it's with practice, right? It happens.
Yeah,
it happens all the time.
Yeah.
Right? And so the daily practice becomes an important thing. And that's why when people have a practice, we see that their ability to deal with things is much clearer. If you wake up in the morning and you say Modani, you start your day immediately by being thankful for things, right? So you immediately hijack that response, that fight or flight response that many people start their day with. They open their eyes and they're, okay, what do I got to do? Where do I got to go? I have this meeting, I have to do that, I have to do that. It makes people crazy. But when you immediately say Modani, right, you enter into that level of gratitude. So you lose that sort of fight or flight thing, and you allow yourself to move into the day from a place of everything is good. And now I'm just going to manifest that in my life. So that's a very easy practice, right? But it's a practice that only works if you do it every day.
Yeah, and I guess what would help you is if you could get connected to the image of the things that were really good, because they say that the chi is where your thoughts are. Okay, so if you really can go, like I can wake up with nightmare images, really dreadful things, and then I can make a shift of image and say, no, I'm going to concentrate in this great moment of love and vision. And then
So
shift, no? So that's
yeah. So we say, for instance, the chi follows the breath, and the breath follows the mind, right? But it's, what you described is great, but it's very hard sometimes when you're thinking about something to change what you're thinking about. It's a very hard task to do. However, very often, just by saying something, right, we could call that maybe the breath, that has an effect on the mind, on the way we're thinking about things, right? So when we say, when you literally say, I'm thankful, I'm thankful, I'm thankful, you become thankful. Just because you're saying it. You might, in the beginning, you might not even believe yourself, but when you say it enough, you start to believe it's true, and then it is true, right?
Yes.
So then it's easier to take your thoughts and to think about, well, I'm thankful for this, that, and the other thing, and then you won't enter into those nightmarish phases like you talked about.
Yes. And like you said, the breath itself, like some time for me to get to that place, I really have to open up and make a really deep breath that most of the time we don't do if we are in this state of constriction.
No, right. Well, Sun Miao, who was a Chinese medicine sage, he's called, who lived, maybe almost 1,500 years ago, he said that disease starts when something happens to us and we go, and we hold our breath. That's always the source of disease, right? So obviously a deep breath can free that up. That's like Rebbe Nachman, he says, there's nothing better than a good krex, a good sigh. You make a nice sigh, it opens everything up, it allows things to move, right? And then it frees up what's stuck.
Yes, and also if I'm not wrong, they say that God listened to the Jewish people there in slavery when finally they sighed. What is the Hebrew word for it? Finally, anyhow, there was this thing of God listened to. It wasn't only tefillah; it was also a sigh, a cry.
Yeah. Look, the Yiddish word is a good word for it, because the Yiddish word is a krex, and that's what it sounds like. It's almost like onomatopoetic. A good krex, you go, it just allows things to you can drop things and move forward, and it works really well. It's another easy practice that you can do.
Maybe the nigun has this sense, because the nigun seems exactly that.
So it's obviously another level is the level of music, and certainly the level of dance, because that frees us up. Music frees us up towards something that we might call inspiration, right? And inspiration is our connection to what at one point might have been called prophecy or Ruach HaKodesh, right? But it's something that we don't know where inspiration comes from. It doesn't come from us, it comes through us. It comes from a place of the unknown. It comes through us, and then we manifest it in whatever we manifest it in. So music helps us to do that, playing and also listening to music. And dancing does the same thing. That takes that inspiration and it makes it very physical, right? And that's why they say it's very hard to be angry or sad when you're dancing. It makes, that movement of going up and down shakes things up and makes things better.
Yes. So that's the real therapy, to dance. And in fact, we have this Hebrew word, mahol, that has the same letter as mahala, like it really
Right.
it transforms it.
Sure. And it's also the same letters as cholom, as dream.
Yeah. And also as mechila, forgiveness, like,
And also as machala, sickness.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So it fixes all of those different things.
Okay, so that's the higher medicine.
That's one of the higher medicines. I mean, I guess there is a hierarchy of medicine. Certainly the things we do every day have a bigger effect on us, right? You do something every day for the good or for the bad, it has a greater impact on your being, on your life. You do yoga once a week. It's a very nice vacation, but it doesn't really do anything for you. You do yoga every day as a practice. It starts to have an effect on who you are and how you behave your whole life. You smoke cigarettes once in a while. It's not really that bad for you. You smoke cigarettes every day, all of a sudden, it's a terrible cancer-causing problem, right? So the daily practice of whatever we're practicing, we could call the best medicine. And that's why food is always the best medicine. Maybe that's the highest medicine, because it's something we do every day.
That's why Rambam was saying that he was curing his patients mainly with food.
Right.
Because that's what we do all the time.
Right. Sorry, it's hard to hold my phone.
It's okay. So this is great. Another thing I wanted to ask you is the prayers, the part that the body plays in the prayers. Like, for example, there is the act of prostration that we don't do anymore, but it was really part of
Right.
So this position, what allows us to...
Let's talk about prostration, because that's actually a very good thing, right?
Okay.
So in its very simplest expression, prostration is bringing the above down to the below, because that's literally what it does. You take your head, which is up in heaven, and you bring it all the way down to the earth. And then when you stand up again, you lift the earth all the way back up to heaven. That's what prostration does, right? That's what it's seen as doing. Now, interestingly enough, when we talk about like the prophetic experience, which is maybe the highest experience and maybe the most necessary experience for our true experience of whatever the godly may be, right? That expression is you take our head and you put it between your legs. That's right in the fetal position. That's called the prophetic position, right? And we see that also in Buddhist meditations and many forms of meditation where you take your head and you wrap it in between your legs, right? Maybe when we prostrate ourselves, maybe that also has to do with that.
Yes. And
Yeah.
it's also with Malchut, it's a contact with the ground, you know, because Malchut is, you know, emet mi eretz titzmach. Because I know that they said when somebody is almost doing a sin, he should put the fingers of his feet down into the earth. I don't know why.
That's from Yosef. That's from the story of Yosef, when Yosef was with the daughter of Potiphar, or the wife of Potiphar, whichever it was, right? And he couldn't hold himself back, and he stuck his hands in his feet. He jumped out the window, and he buried his fingers and toes into the ground.
Uh-huh. Okay.
So that he could control his urge, so to speak.
Okay. So what is the power inherent in this thing of? Because
Well,
you can
maybe here we could use something from Chinese medicine, right? So the bottom of the foot is the place where the kidney meridian starts, right? Right at the base of the foot, we have the first point on the kidney meridian. And then in the palms, in the center of the palm, we have a point on the pericardium meridian, right? And those 4 points, really, because 2 arms, 2 legs, are very important things that we utilize all the time in Qigong. But it could be maybe that's understood as they have to be places of very, very great power. The center of our hands, the center of our feet, the meeting of all the nerves that come through those areas, the ganglia that express themselves in there. They're also sort of as centers. They're also we can call them the heart of our hand and the heart of our foot, just like the heart of our body. Even though it's not exactly in the center of our torso, we think about it as being the center of our torso, where our solar plexus are, right? So these are places, obviously, of great power, and they're places with which we meet the world, and the world meets us, right? So when we use those in terms of our relationship to the ground, in relationship to Malchut, right? What we're doing is we're bringing these great places of power and consciousness into connection with where we come from and where we grow from, right? Where we grow out of. So by returning to that source, we could say, maybe that's a level of practice that enables us to return to our own source. Maybe.
Also to humbleness, actually, because Melech is the king, is the one who's humble, and sometimes we really have to put our head into the dust to feel it.
Sure. That's why, like, you always see, like in the Torah, whenever anything happens, people throw themselves on the ground.
Yeah.
God gets angry at Moses and Aaron. The first thing they do is they throw themselves on the ground as an act of becoming humble, of humility.
Yeah.
Certainly.
Yeah. It's such a pity that we lost this habit, because the Arabs are doing it, so we cannot do it anymore. But it was really part of our prayer.
Right. That we've lost, but we have aspects that we can still manifest of that part of prayer. And of course, look, everybody makes up their own mind how they want to pray ultimately anyway.
Yeah, well, not everybody do, but
But look, so many people do I don't know, sun salutations, right? A lot of people would say, oh, well, that's not really cool. But, still people do it. Even Orthodox people do it because it's an expression of how we can do prostration in a way as a form of service, as a form of health. Maybe.
Yes.
Yeah.
So then the last thing maybe we can talk about today, and actually I would love to propose a course in Chinese medicine and Kabbalah, starting from the Psalms and the Jewish prayers, because I've seen that in the prayers there is so much material in the prayers, more than in any other thing.
Okay.
So we could propose, an ongoing weekly discussion, maybe for a month or so, or two, okay, facing these aspects, yes, of the psychosomatic, we can call it, psychosomatic in the sound.
I mean, it's interesting because obviously prayers are something we say every day. Again, it goes back to that aspect of daily practice having its effect over the long term, which is what prayers do. And a lot of people who don't even know what they're saying in their prayer, just by saying the prayers, it has an effect on them, because while they're saying them, they're trying to make a connection to something that's more than just themselves. And that actually makes a connection to something that's more than just themselves, just because of the intention of doing that, even if they don't know what they're saying. Obviously, if you do know what you're saying, even more so, but level upon level. Yeah. But that sounds like an interesting idea.
Yes, yes.